And we might still have some more people trickle in, but Karam, we can go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
So, welcome everybody. We're talking about overcoming barriers to implementing soil health practices. We will be hearing from Kerem from Gwenyn Hill today, talking about kind of their journey with implementing these practices, including some sticking points or some future goals going forward.
Mhm.
So we really want to open this up to a broader discussion after Kerem presents and hopefully brainstorm some solutions and also have other people share their successes and sticking points. So Kerem, take it away.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Emily, for inviting me. So what I'm hoping to do today is obviously I am going to talk about some of our efforts, some of our adventures in reducing tillage at Gwenyn Hill Farm. I am going to try to do this by I'm going to briefly offer some context into who we are, kind of the scale of operations, then share some initial observations that I made and some of the structural organizational realities that kind of uh, were some sticking points. From there, I'm going to talk about some of the shifts that we put into place last year, and then I'll introduce just a couple of pieces of equipment that has helped us during this shift period. Next, I'm going to briefly walk through some of our seasonal cover cropping practices and some of my priorities and strategies. Next, I'm going to talk about a few experiments that we have initiated, and please take that word experiments very, very, with some skepticism. It was admittedly not as structured as I would like it to be, and that's one of our areas of growth. But we've definitely, in short, we've tried some things, and I'm going to share some of my observations. And lastly, I'm going to just point into the future, into this coming year, and talk about a few things that I would like to put into practice, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So briefly, as I said, so Gwenyn Hill Farm, as some of you know, is a fairly large. We are a 460-acre operation, but for today's purposes, we're only going to focus on the 12 acres here on the screen. That these are our vegetable fields. Within the fields, we have about range of soils. We have sandy loam in certain pockets and some heavier clay soils as well. So that is one of our structural realities. Our fields are divided into 36 plots that are roughly 220 by 60 feet. And at the height of the season, we manage this operation with 8 full-time crew, including myself. So when I joined Gwenyn Hill Farm 4 years ago as an apprentice, one of my initial observations was that tillage seemed like a pretty much a default reset tool. And I think a lot of vegetable farmers of any certain scale will probably concede to that, where tillage ends up being a kind of a magic erase button. And cover cropping was, I'm afraid to say, was more aspirational rather than embedded into our um, weekly, monthly workflow. So our practice was, beds came out of production. If necessary, we would mow and then we would till. And depending on the time of the season, the fields would be left bare with the optimistic hope that they would be in fall, go into cover crops. One visible, one thing that we've noticed, of course, was we had some serious visible structural issues. We had a lot of crusting, we had a lot of cracking, and fair amount of rain gullies and serious amounts of compaction in the field. We still have these problems, but we realized that soil protection was not particularly embedded into our workflow. One reason was that, and I think a lot of you might relate to this, is that harvest pressure drove most of our decisions in labor allocation practices. So the structural reality at the farm was that the field crew, the 6 of us that worked in the field, 2 people usually are in the pack shed any given day. So the entire field crew would focus on the harvest, and any other tasks, whether it be weed management or other field transitions, ended up being secondary to harvest. And as a result, as a consequence, bare soil, I'm afraid, was kind of normalized and accepted because it simply simplified the logistics, the labor allocation piece of the puzzle. So the question for us became, well, given these circumstances, given these problems we're having that we're really seeing in our soils, how can we make soil protection more central? How can we make it more operational to our practices inside this really harvest-driven system? So at the end of my 2-year apprenticeship, our general manager, our farm production manager, myself sat down and put our heads together to kind of see what kind of shifts can we put into place. And the decision that we made, the solution we found, wasn't really any major technical change, but it was an organizational change. What we decided to do ultimately was creating a dedicated field manager role, my role. So the shift was one of management. It wasn't really introducing any new machinery or just kind of reinventing the wheel. One thing that this did was that it made these field transitions and cover cropping clear responsibility. And cover cropping obviously became my job, whereas before I and the rest of the team were just kind of limited by the pressures of harvest and washback schedules. What this did was it freed me from the dictates of harvest and washback, and allowed me to actually just keep clear track of any kind of pockets that were opening, that were coming out of production, and just find the time to go out there and stale seedbed and just put in cover crops. So our new transition protocol ended up being that as soon as a bed came out of production, I would go out with a tine weeder and stale seedbed if necessary, drill in cover crops, irrigate if necessary, and the important point being that we were trying to avoid leaving soil exposed as much as possible. And our kind of mantra at the farm became like, nothing leaves production without something replacing it. One of our problems was we had a lot of reactive practices. Fields would be left open. And of course, we all know what happens, with some disturbed and open soil, annual weeds, perennial weeds take over. So we wanted to reduce reactive tillage. And we tried, this also new position allowed us to really reduce those weed windows. And ultimately what it does, it really changed our reflexes, because, we kind of had this structural room now to actually incorporate, to find the time to go out there and just fill those pockets with cover cropping whenever we had the chance. As you all know, as we try to use cover cropping as a reduced tillage tool, the establishment window is really critical. So kind of really maximize taking the establishment window. We determined that irrigation is probably one of the lowest hanging fruits here. And here I have to offer a quick shout out to Kat Becker, Cattail Organics, which most of you I'm sure know. A few years ago at the OVPC, at one of her sessions, when she talked about her cover cropping practices, she made the point to treat your cover crops just like cash crops, and we really took that lesson to heart. And operationally, what that meant is that we would include cover crops into our irrigation schedule. It simply required me to coordinate with our irrigation lead and make sure that even despite however busy they are, that cover crops should not be neglected and be part of the irrigation schedule. Obviously, the purpose being that, I think we all know if reduced tillage ultimately does fail, if the cover crop stands are poorly established and invite weeds. So irrigation seemed like a simplest high impact improvement we could do there. So next, I want to introduce you to a couple of pieces of equipment that we incorporated into our vegetable operation. These were tools that we already had at the farm, but were not things that we were using in the veggie fields. This Hudson Bichler 16 feet hydraulic operated pine weeder is something we started utilizing. Of course, one thing it did was it allowed us to go into the fields quite earlier than we would do if we had to till. It allowed stale seed bedding without resorting to inversion. And early in the season, it really allowed us to put in cover crops or reduce the number of pre-cover crop tillage passes. In many instances, it eliminated them completely. Ultimately, what it did, it just added a second piece of second tool to our arsenal and reduced our dependence on tillage as kind of a problem eraser. The second piece of equipment is this beautiful ESH 5605 no-till drill. Here, I have to admit that we are definitely, even though this is a no-till drill, we are definitely far from being a no-till operation. Our aim at this point is simply to reduce tillage. Admittedly, our cover crops go into some form of prepared ground, either tilled or tine weeded. But this tool, obviously, if with those wavy coulters and the double disc openers, allows a high level of precision and consistency in our stands. Looking in the future, as far as equipment goes, we are very much interested in incorporating a flail mower. It's not something I've had the pleasure of working with to this point. I am particularly interested in working in heavier residue kind of surface mulch system. And if anyone has experience in that, when we open up for discussion, I would be thrilled to hear what you practice in that regard. So I briefly wanted to talk a little bit about some of our seasonal cover crop mixes, but before I just run through those, I just wanted to stay clear that one of my priorities, for better or worse, I've been pushing to increase the species diversity in our cover crop mixes. I know that increasing diversity in cover crop mixes adds some management complexity, managing the competitive hierarchies, the various termination difficulties, seeding rate decisions, etc. But I am of the opinion, especially as we're trying to build soil and also provide some habitat to beneficial insects, some of the trade-offs that a diverse mix offers might be worth tackling. Obviously, I still have a lot to learn, as shortly some of our experiments will tell you. I still am trying to figure out how to manage species hierarchy in diverse mixes. And obviously, what I'm trying to get at it by establishing somewhat of a diverse mix is incorporating some taking advantage of root architecture, diversity, as we all know, different root structures build soil in different ways, trying to kind of take advantage, use the leverage of the layering of the canopy and weed suppression. And of course, by adding some herbaceous plants in introducing some habitat for beneficial insects, especially through umbelliferous plants, try to provide some nectar, some food source for various parasitic wasps. So very briefly, the mixes we've used are again, I should admit that I have not been very good at taking photos, so I don't have a clear photo of everything I'm talking about here. Our spring and fall mixes are fairly similar. We used farm-grown oats and peas. And in the spring, I've tried to add some diversity by adding some herb fennel, some cilantro, and some dill into this mix. Although I made the mistake of just only using the big hopper of the no-till drill, and they just got very too deep, I think. So one thing I'm going to try next year is kind of coat them with surround to kind of eliminate some of the static and just use the small seed hopper in the hopes of and maybe increasing the percentage of some herbaceous plants to be able to establish a more diverse mix. For our late summer and fall mixes, I used about 5% by volume daikon radish seed. And as you can tell, I mean, we've managed a pretty successful stand here. And we've tried a few different rates. I've ranged between 150 pounds to 200 pounds per acre. So we have had a pretty good stand. You can tell it almost seems like what we ended up having is more than 5% of daikon, but that is kind of what I had added. In the summer, we really like the Albert Lee's Summer Max mix, even though I know it has various other species as well. Our stand ended up being fairly buckwheat, sorghum, sudan grass, and cowpea heavy. I was hoping for sunflowers as well, just to take advantage of their tap roots and some of their ecological functions and high biomass as well. But unfortunately, in this case, sunflowers, even though I added more than the Albert Lee mix already had, it was a complete bust. The sunflowers were not able to outcompete, probably because of my high seeding rate. I think if I recall correctly, I've added about 100 pounds per acre of the Summer Max this year. This photo later in the season of a similar stand, a couple of notes here. So one thing you're seeing, the little awkward the little pockets with the bare soil around it. This was a result of me going in there when I had the window of opportunity while some cash crops were still in the ground, where I put in this Summer Max mix. And then shortly after this photo, this stand was mowed and then put into a full cover crop. And this photo was taken by Emily when she came to our farm to do a biomass study. Those are the bags right there. And Emily, maybe later you can kind of add a little bit more context to some of the numbers I'm going to share. Based on her assessment, we were happily well above most of the thresholds for some of the cover crop functions that we're looking for, whether it's erosion control or weed suppression. At the lowest end, her sample came in at about 7,400 pounds, and at the upper end, we were at 15,000 pounds. I think some of the thresholds for erosion are as low as 1,500 pounds. So we were very lucky. I imagine some of the intense moisture, the heavy rainfall that we've had some bearing on what a solid stand we've had this year. So next, I want to briefly point to a few experiments we did. Some that worked okay, some weren't all that great. This one wasn't as promising. So the previous year, we had broadcasted some Dutch white clover under our popcorn, which was a smashing success. And that winter, as we were kind of assessing the fields for the coming year, we noticed the healthy Dutch white clover stand, and we thought we cannot, in good conscience, mow this, and we have to see what we can do here. And we decided we would use our U-pick cherry tomatoes as kind of a sacrificial crop. And we put those, we opened up, we did not strip a wide area to clear it from the clover. We just pretty much drilled it right into it. We periodically, about once every 2 weeks, mowed it. To our disappointment, even though our CSA got enough produce got enough of a harvest out of the tomatoes, overall, I'm confident to say that it was a bust. Our yields were significantly lower. The plants really took their sweet time to get a size, and I'm guessing it had something to do with the soil moisture and lower soil temperatures. So we could not quite manage that. Another thing that worked, our living aisle between our kale. This had some straw mulch on it and some red clover drilled or broadcasted into the pathways. That was a success. The cherry tomatoes in Dutch white clover, definitely not. One of our more promising experiments was our little living aisle experiment in our field peppers. In years past, we've had our peppers on plastic. This particular year, for some reason or another, we ended up growing our peppers on bare ground. So after a couple of tractor cultivating passes over the peppers, right before tractors could no longer straddle it, I realized we were going to have to constantly keep visiting the pathways with hose, and I just wanted to avoid that. So I went in and broadcasted some red clover and drilled in with a single row jang 4 rows of buckwheat. And we've had a pretty good establishment. I had to make one pass and just hand weed the pathways. And then later in the season, just a few weeks later, we had a pretty good canopy. And despite that, I was getting a little concerned about airflow. So we decided it was time to terminate it. And admittedly, we did not necessarily have any in-house tools to properly terminate it. We thought we could just simply mow this with a push mower. To our disappointment, the push mower, the stand was too dense for the push mower to manage it. But we discovered that without engaging the push mower, we could just use it as a roller. That worked quite well, but of course, a roller isn't a crimper. About a week or so after, the buckwheat just kind of gently started poking up again. And at that point, we were able to make a second pass with the mower and just terminate. We made a fairly high cut. We're able to terminate the buckwheat, and what remained was a pretty nice stand of red clover. So I'm still we'll continue to experiment with various living aisle arrangements. I'm very curious if any of you do the same. I think we will try something similar in some of our longer season crops. Um, this one, it's hard to quite call it an experiment. It was more so me testing kind of the limits of what I'm willing to, or how late I'm willing to terminate a cover crop, especially buckwheat in this instance. I don't have a particular picture or a specific picture of the field that I'm talking about, but this indicates a similar dynamic. So we've had a midsummer buckwheat planting in a field that was slated for garlic later in the season. Um, I thought to myself, well, what is the worst? As farmers, we try to be careful about the management window and the termination window. But with buckwheat, I have pretty wide tolerance. And I thought to myself, what is the worst that can happen if I let this buckwheat go to seed and shed some seed, which is what we did in a few fields. And to my surprise, what I ended up getting is after letting the buckwheat shed its seed and mowing, that pretty much within a couple of weeks, we've had a pretty solid second flush of buckwheat. And this was still about a month and a half, 2 months before the field had to be prepared for garlic. And that gave me the freedom to not bother with that field at all. So what this taught me is that, succession can be leveraged and termination timing can create certain opportunities if managed carefully. Admittedly, this was kind of a lucky break. In this particular picture, the same happened, only it came out in between a full oats and peas cover crop mix, which for a while, helped, I think, just keep some of the other annual weeds at bay. Another thing we've been trying is, I don't have a picture for this, unfortunately. Given that we plant a lot of dill and cilantro, we have about 10, 11 successions peppered across the field. We wanted to see if we can, as long as we can manage the weeds in those crops effectively. We thought, can we experiment with letting these herbs, transition and just offer us some ecological function and offer some soil protection instead of terminating them immediately. As I said, we have multiple successions across the field. So what we ended up having was what we do, I guess I should add, is we have 5 rows on our beds and we do some selective harvesting. We kind of thin as if we were kind of letting them mature as if you were harvesting seeds. So we would harvest them by the root and just space them out about 4 inches apart, and then just make sure that the stand itself had minimal weeds. And this allowed us to actually have these pockets of covered soil and some habitat functions, some great sources for beneficial insects. Looking ahead, a few things that I'm hoping to do this year is one of the main things is a new strategy to manage some of our field edges, particularly the northern and southern edges of our fields. Maybe you have similar problems in our context. The northern and southern edges are probably the least productive portions. They have persistent annual weed pressure. And that repeated disturbance, has definitely increased that pressure. So one thing I'm proposed to do this year is as I said, the fields are 220 by 60. We are going to dedicate strips along those edges for multiple seasons and throughout the season to keep in cover crops. The process is going to be after the initial tillage and stale seed bedding. I'm going to drill in cover crops, a diverse mix as best as I can. And we're going to rotate the edges, spring, summer, and through fall cover crops. And we're going to mow and use our no-till drill to kind of put in the next stage in cover crops. So our goal is, of course, instead of fighting weeds repeatedly, we kind of wanted to occupy that space continuously for a few seasons in the hopes of reclaiming those field edges. Another thing that I'm toying with is I'm kind of interested in learning more about establishing seed mixes that offer some sort of like functional redundancy by adding some additional belt and suspenders kind of multiple species of legumes or grasses. To that end, one thing I'm experimenting with this year is a new summer mix. One thing I want to try is a mix of buckwheat, fenugreek as a leguminous plant, daikon, and sunflowers. I think I was a little scarred by how competitive, of course, sorghum Sudan grass is, and I'm curious if I can just get a decent coverage and just I also want to see how well fenugreek will perform. I know it doesn't grow as much biomass as cowpeas, but I know it has moderate drought tolerance and can establish it quite easily and establish a canopy quite easily. So I kind of wanted to see in at least one of our fields how that will function. Um, okay, so to wrap up, um, some of our from learnings from last year's that to recount again, our reduced tillage system primarily management changes, some management discipline, not so much as any changes in a machine system or incorporating new equipment. And we've, as I said, we've really established that establishment was really key. And I think we've gotten really good stands of cover crops. And even in 1 year, we could really see some massive decline in some of our annual wheat pressures. Um, so we attribute that to irrigation and making sure that we were able to put in cover crops in a timely manner, taking advantage of those windows where weeds would have otherwise taken over. And last, of course, I'm very interested in learning how to manage and improve cover crop diversity, species diversity, and trying to manage that complexity effectively. And I'm very curious to hear if or to what extent you balance the mix between the ease of managing and terminating a single or a very low species standard cover crop mix versus incorporating adding some functional redundancy to your mixes. So this is what we've been doing. What I hope anything I've shared has been of some value, and I'm curious to hear about what your practices have been like.
Thanks so much, Kerem. It's so exciting to see the changes you've made over the last couple of years at Gwenyn Hill and excited to see what's going to happen this season. So love to open it up to if anyone has any questions for Kerem, anyone has any experience with what he's been talking about and has some advice.
I had a a question from early in the presentation, and thank you very much for all that information. Um, Something that we'd been dealing with is when I came into this farm, we would do oats and medium red clover for cover crops in a lot of our spring fields that we have generally good luck with. But we would basically overseed the red clover by about twice the recommended amount because we would use our disc to mix the grass seed and the soil together. And with the size of the clover seed, it's quite small, and we get poor germination, which is why we would just overseed. I was curious about, and I may have missed a part of it. You had mentioned using the tine weeder to help prepare for cover crop, and specifically, I believe you did mention red clover. So I was just curious of kind of to learn a little bit more about that process. Is it just red clover, and does the tine weeder work well to incorporate that seed? Rather than doing what we've done, which is disking the field again. And I'd really like to get away from that.
Admittedly, I have not used a time weeder to incorporate cover crop seeds. It was more so just kind of stale seed bedding in anticipation of the cover crops, just allowing a flush of weeds to come up and then just going with the time weeder, which allowed me to prepare the field without any inversion. Um, and I don't know what scale you do this at, and my experiments with what red clover has been just fairly limited and at the aisle level. So given the lack of any other equipment, I've simply used a push seeder, right? Which is a very low key, low tech equipment. And I didn't do much more than just kind of gently rake the surface and then just drill in some buckwheat. But yeah, I mean, One thing as far as smaller seeds I can say is that I've had some failures with mixing all of our seeds, large and small seeds, into the big hopper. And one thing I've learned this year, I'm looking into mixing some of the small seeds into the small seed hopper, the no-till drill. And I've been advised to also just gently coat them with surround. I think this is maybe more common practice. Any one of you might actually have more information on this, to kind of reduce some of the static and just kind of allow them to kind of singulate more readily. So that is what I'm hoping to do, to establish a diverse mix with larger and smaller seeds. Just kind of use the small seed hopper. But the tine weeder again was not a direct implement to that end to incorporate seeds.
Okay, well, thank you. Using this around sounds like a pretty good way. I mean, I'd thought about maybe trying sand, but I think this spring we're going to try to seed the grass seed in first, work that in with the disc, and then overseed the clover. And my thought was even a tine weeder over that might be enough to just cover that lightly enough to get it to germinate. So I'll let you guys know how that works out.
I think I see in the chat that Sandy said that he's had success, and I've heard stories through his conversations with other folks on our farm that he's had success incorporating cover crop seeds with tine weeder. So I guess I should talk to him a little bit more because that could be quite effective.
Hey,
Well,
Kerem, it's Rufus.
oh, you can go. You can go, Rufus.
Oh, okay, all right, thank you. Yeah, hey, nice to hear your farming stories there, buddy. Good to see the farm. I'm kind of living the best of both worlds here. I'm actually doing some no-till bed prep while I'm listening to you. But your cover crop thing got me thinking it'd be kind of cool to have a mix that was just a mix of easy to terminate cover crop. So, no small grains, nothing that kind of lingers there, something that's like a mix that's really easy to terminate and then degrades really fast. That'd be a fascinating mix to try.
I mean, buckwheat is notorious in that sense, no? And how quickly it just pretty much disintegrates.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking. But I like your thinking, and it seems like a bunch of other folks that have been working the cover crop scene now are getting into this idea of just like that, the diversity of stuff in there, too, to just sort of like increase the diversity. And so buckwheat, and then what else? Maybe there's like a 5 seed mix, or what? Who knows what number you could get to? That's
Mhm.
just all really easy terminating things. That would be fun to like kind of play with and share with.
One thing that recently caught my eye is I think in a recent meeting, Rue shared some of the living isle studies that some of the other farms in the network had done. And if I'm not mistaken, Tenzin from Red Door had essentially introduced some of the functional redundancy that I'm kind of asking about by mixing a couple of different types of grasses. I think for a spring mix, he had used both oats and millet, if I'm not mistaken, to kind of hedge his bets, given that we never know what kind of a season we're going to have. And that kind of just redundancy is quite interesting. I know it increases the seed cost, but I'm curious if any of you have kind of experimented with that.
Way to go! Happy farming, buddy.
Well, I just want to say, like, from when I was at Glennon Hill to like what you guys are doing now, it's so good to see that. Like, because yeah, seeing barren fields like all year round and like the soil's cracking and like there's just so much erosion, like it's really disheartening. And I feel like you have made like leaps and bounds in this last season implementing your systems prim. So this is awesome to see. And it's here, like the farm that I moved to, we're really small. We're doing a lot, but we're really small. We're about at like an acre and a half of production, all in permanent raised bed systems. And I've like had many thoughts of like trying to implement some sort of living aisle. But since we're so small, we end up like we're cropping most spaces like 2 to 3 times a year. And so most of our cover cropping like is then like a winter kill cover crop. I hope to implement some sort of summer cover crop this year potentially, but it's just been difficult to balance with what we need this land to produce versus like just the time and labor it takes. And we're also totally like non-mechanized. We don't have a flail mower, we don't have a BCS. So terminating that cover crop is also like we need to be able to do that in a timely manner. So we've been heavily reliant on like oats, peas, daikon that will winter kill. I'm a little bit scared of clover just taking over because we have, I don't know, I feel like it might just take over our small growing spaces. But I don't know. I feel like I'm brewing up some ideas in my brain watching what you guys were doing. And I was like, oh yeah, they're doing the good stuff. I like it.
One thing you said actually just brings up a thought that I didn't share, Laura. One thing I would love to do, and it's a little hard with our, production pressures or sales pressures. I mean, the farm, by the time, we decided to put some of these practices or just face some of the soil realities, our marketing base or our sales pressure was set that we have to keep pretty much all of the 12 acres in production. I mean, if I could just wave a magic wand, I would take half of it out of production and actually just do like a 2 years on, 2 years off kind of system. But I mean, that hasn't been feasible. We would completely have to reshuffle the size of our CSA and various other parts. But I think that is probably one of the best ways of managing reduced tillage and kind of weaving that in with this really production or harvest intensive system. And I'm curious if any of you practice or run your operations in that way, where you have run your vegetable fields from plot to plot and just keep it out of production for a couple of years.
That's pretty much the way we're headed over here. We're on the property 60 acres, 40 acres is in vegetable production. We generally stick to about half of that. We discussed this year moving into a 2 year on, 2 year off. When we started, there wasn't a set pattern of cover cropping, and we'd identified fields that hadn't had it in many years and wanted to kind of focus on those that have been kind of beat up. But we're looking to do that. We just haven't implemented it yet. But we're on a little bit more space than you do, and I definitely understand that loss of production there. I'm not sure how that would work for you guys.
We're kind of looking at the same thing. We're lucky enough to have enough land to be able to do it, but I think last month I had mentioned that what we're hoping to do is like 1 year in cover crops and then putting in our sweet potato rotation, which when we take those out sets us up for, kind of semi-permanent beds for a couple years and then starting all over again in a couple years.
I see Tenzin on the call. I was wondering if I may pull you into the conversation only because I referenced you and in particular in reference to the Living Isle study that you had done and shared with Rue. And Rue shared that with us recently, and I was quite interested in some of the functional redundancy that you had kind of made in your mix to kind of hedge your bets against various different seasonal conditions. If you are available, I would love to hear about that and your experience and to that end.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to that. So just kind of tying it into what you were just talking about, we don't do like half of our acreage gets rested for that long. Every 5th year, it gets a rest from one fall through to a spring, 2 springs. So one full year with the winters on either end. But that's only a 1/5 of our ground at a time. But we do have enough room in our, we're farming about 12 acres of vegetables as well, but we're not doing it fully intensively. So what I do is I just drive outside the wheel track for anything that is going into our plastic mulch beds. So it ends up being about 3 feet of aisle and 3 feet of bed space. So half of that field is being cover cropped with a living aisle and half of it is being cultivated into vegetables. So it's a kind of a land extensive way to go about it. And then, yeah, in that mix, I do a few different mixes depending on the time of year and depending on, you know, what's happening the following season on that ground. But I like to have a diversity of things in there, and I find that usually everything grows, so it's kind of a redundancy to hedge bets because if it's, you know, cold and wet, the oats will go, and if it's hot and dry, the millet will go. And because it's the aisle way, it you know, it's not as resilient as the ground would be in other, like in the bed, where there's like a proper seed bed made. You know, it's pretty compacted and that sort of stuff. So I find that the crops kind of, you know, they don't thrive there in that aisle, but we've found crops that perform the best there. So it's usually oats, oats and white Dutch clover are the basis of it. Then I often add in millet and or teff and or annual ryegrass if it's going into that big fallow period. And if it's around our strawberry plantings, I'll take the clover out of there because we were having problems with thrips. When we'd go in and mow off the clover blossoms, they would chase all the thrips into the strawberries. So there'd be a big population of thrips in the clover, but then once you would mow that off, they'd all jump into the strawberry blossoms. So, like I say, there's kind of like different variations of it all over the place. I have been playing with putting flax in there a little bit. It doesn't handle the traffic as well, but it's nice because it doesn't grow real tall in that setting, and then it will have flowers later. And typically I can get away with 1 or maybe 2 mowings per aisle. If I wait and let it get till the oats are starting to set seed and then mow it off, oats and or millet, then it will kind of reset and they'll set seed again, but they're much more stunted and manageable.
Is there a type of millet you use for that or any? I know when I've looked in cover crops, there's several different ones, and I wasn't familiar with all the millets that are out. I'm just kind of curious which one you found luck with.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember now. I think it's just pearl millet. I noticed there was a Japanese millet. I was looking at Green Cover's website for some different cover crops that I wanted to start playing with, and they had a Japanese millet in there that sounded a bit intriguing. I can't remember what of the qualities it was that was intriguing to me now though.
Cool, thank you. I think that gives me a place to start. It's just a matter of picking one and seeing how it does over here. But that sounds like a good idea to kind of hedge your bets on that with the clover. Hearing about the success that you had also with the clover between your peppers, that's definitely something we want to look at doing this year because we're still in plastic mulchville and we'd like to get out of plastic mulchville. But it's a process.
Yeah, same. My goal was to have that be a temporary thing on our farm and work our way out of plastic mulch, and I feel like we just keep adding more. But I feel like the living aisles is like my penance for the plastic mulch. So that's how I look at it personally. The the teff grass, when I've used that holds up to traffic. That's the only grass I've found that kind of besides the annual rye. Once that gets established, it'll hold up to anything, it seems like. Annual rye grass specifically, not like cereal rye. But that white Dutch clover, it's slow to establish, which is why we've first started putting all the other stuff in there. But once it establishes, I mean, it's amazing the tractive power that it has and the ability to grow in compaction and the ability to persist. We'll disc up the field at the end and plant fall cover crops, and then the next spring there's these strips of clover that emerge through that and take off. And so I think they're doing a lot to hold the soil and to be pumping sugars into the ground all throughout the winter, that late fall and early spring. I mean, probably not throughout the winter, but
I say we've had pretty good luck with the white clover between our tomato beds. We need enough space to harvest there. It's basically an empty bed that gets left, and before they
Yep.
just mow the weeds on it. But that clover does do a pretty good job. I'm curious about the trying to plant the tomatoes right into the clover. We've talked about that, but it sounds like that's something we want to consider with a little bit more thought before we jump into that.
yeah, I have tried a couple trials and not had very good success, but there's people do it. Like I know Helen Attow has a book about how she's doing all that, and it's impressive. I saw her at Acres this year, and it sounds really cool. And it's a very, it's a similar climate. I mean, it's different. It's Montana or whatever, but it's similar latitude at any rate.
In the questionnaire I'd sent out ahead of time, someone had commented on possibly using Essex rapeseed for living mulches. Has anyone experimented with that before?
I mean, I'm too afraid to plant more brassicas on our farm. But I am thinking about putting it into not as a living mulch, but as a cover crop, using it for late fall cover cropping.
How's everyone's relationship with daikon radishes? I mean, I definitely am in love with them, and I know we already have all sorts of issues with our broccoli. I'm not sure to what extent adding daikon to our cover crop mix is going to exacerbate the problem. I'm curious what you guys experience.
Well, we've been using it for about 2 years in our fall crops to try to help with some of the hard pan that's developed here over the years. We like it. I haven't run into any issues with it. We do have a decent amount of space, so by having brassicas, maybe that's just not as big of an issue for us. Outside of when that stuff winter kills, if you've got a good stand, it can be kind of smelly. We're surrounded by houses, so that's something I get to hear about. But it's good for the soil so far. We haven't had any trouble.
We used to use it in a cover crop mix, and then we were developing brassica problems. And one of the things that we did to try to offset that was getting rid of that in our fall cover crop. But the other thing we did was moving to these living aisles, so we're spreading those brassica beds out a little bit, letting a little more airflow through there, and having a little more plant diversity in the field. I don't know. The incidence of problems diminished, but didn't get gone. And I'm thinking about bringing radishes back into the fall, like I was mentioning, but that's all I don't know.
I was talking to Rue at the Marble Seed Conference this last weekend, and one of the interesting things that's happened in our like our bigger tractor beds that are kind of quasi-permanent beds. I noticed last year they started becoming filled with some sort of clover. I didn't seed any of it, but it's just sort of like seeding itself, which I'm kind of excited about because I'm hoping like in lieu of tilling those beds this year, we're going to just put some compost on the top of them, and then those aisleways are just going to sort of naturally move into clover. Has anybody ever noticed that too?
We sometimes get a lot of sweet clover that comes in all on its own. And we let those fields go if they get a good stand in it because it's a good nitrogen fixer.
By sweet clover, are you like that's the red flowered one?
It's a yellow, it's a yellow, some white and then some yellow.
Okay,
So
okay,
no red clover, no.
okay, gotcha.
It gets pretty tall. It probably gets a good, 3, 4 feet tall.
Okay, cool.
We are nearing the end of our time, so I just want to remind everyone, please fill out the evaluation. Let us know what you thought of this topic and what you want to see in the future. But are there any more cover crop questions, reduced tillage questions, maybe practices people are thinking about implementing for this season that they want to, brainstorm with other farmers while we got the moment?
One thing that's on my mind is we're trying to do in some of our shorter beds for our quicker successional crops, salad radishes, turnips, some of our greens that we don't need 500-foot beds of, is moving into a deep compost mulch. I've done it on a small scale when I had my own small plot and it worked well, but I've heard kind of some mixed results trying to use that at a larger scale. And I was curious if anybody has gotten into that as a way to reduce some tillage um, with a slightly different avenue.
I haven't yet, but I'm getting close to it. I almost had a um, attachment to the skid steer. That's a sand shooting sand bucket, whatever you call it. I lost out on the bid. I just wasn't quite ready to pull the trigger yet, but I'm hoping once I get that implement that will be, and this would be more like 100-foot beds, so maybe not more than that. But if I can get a way where I can put more compost down easier, then that's when I'll start trying to do that. Right now, we're just like using it in our greenhouses and shorter bed stuff, and we're just doing that by hand, which I've kind of been doing the meeting here.
Yeah, that's basically where we're looking at, like 100-foot beds for some of those crops. We did have to replace our mulch spreader, and I ended up going with a Mill Creek. I don't know if you've seen any of the Mill Creek machines. They're designed mostly for orchards, I guess, but I've used that a little bit here this spring, and it looks like it'd be a great machine for getting compost down in a thick layer on a bed. But it's not cheap by any means either.
Yeah, like you can see the skid steer behind me. We got the bucket of compost there. It's just the side shooter is just a different bucket. It's got the hydraulics. And it should allow us to just be putting compost right in the bed next to us. So
Nice.
yeah, one of these days, one of those, I think, hopefully. It was like the brand new. I saw that make and model is like $8,000, and at the auction, I think the end price was somewhere around 1,000 for it. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
I mean,
seems much more reasonable for a lot of folks that might not be able to get a new spreader like luckily we were able to do that here.
yeah, you have to have a skid steer with the auxiliary hydraulics on there, so you have the extra line. But if you have that tool, then yeah, it could be a game changer.
Cool, thank you.
You bet.
We have like a very deep composting system in our high tunnels. I'd say too deep at this point, but it's at this point now where even when I like dig down like 6 inches to take a soil test, like our OM is in the 20s, which is not good in my mind. That's like way too high, and then our pH is also high due to that. So last year, to help like counteract this a little bit, we just didn't add any compost. which is they were doing like 2 inches of compost at every bed flip, like 3 times a year. That's where I got to that point, which is really expensive also if you're not making your own compost. So we're having the opposite issue where we're trying to like dial back our OM a little bit just because we're still like producing really high, but also like compost dries out a lot faster than soil. And so we're watering all the time. It's not holding on onto that moisture. And like everything in our soil test is like very high. So I feel like it's just like when you're in a tunnel system, it's really difficult to control that as well. You definitely overdo it.
We
you
had
seen
even
any?
done that out. Oh, I'm sorry. We had done that for just a couple years in a grant project, and everything went super high in that too. The organic matter was high, not crazy, but potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, all that stuff was just through the roof. And that was only 2 years outside.
I see a comment in here about disease pressure in the tunnels, and honestly, last year it wasn't too bad. They had like really terrible aphid issues on all the greens that were grown in the tunnels in prior years, but last year we saw very minimal aphid issues, and that's like those suckering pests, like they come on when like the OM is really high. But also what they haven't done is like rotating their crops. So like the tomatoes in the tunnel had been grown in the same tunnel for 6 years. And so this year we're getting another tunnel because we need to start rotating them. So I feel like it just also comes down to just like sometimes you can't control how the land has been managed. And if you can control it from the start, that is best. But I feel like we're just trying to dial it in a little bit. Yeah, disease pressure, it hasn't been too much of an issue. Like we have some like flea beetles in the spring, but they usually go away by the time the tomatoes need to go in there. And yeah, we planted. Ooh, a fun thing we did last year was they also had a lot of tomato hornworm issues, and we planted calendula in there every 8 inches, which was too much calendula in our tunnels to help counteract because I was reading a study, I think it was by SARS last winter, about whatever smell they're producing, the tomato hornworms don't like it. And we only found 2 tomato worms in their summer in our tunnels. Granted, we had to harvest the calendula every week because we didn't want too much of it self-seeding. But then we just but definitely that was not a fun task for folks last summer. But I feel like it was worth it because we didn't have any tomato hornworms.
Laura and Sandy, quick question for you. What sort of compost are you using? Is it like a plant-based compost or like an animal manure-based compost?
Yeah,
When
it's
you
all
were seeing the
plant-based.
issues of the building up of the nutrients.
It is
It was
plant-based. It's from Blue Ribbon.
We had
Milwaukee.
used a plant-based and it was from Purple Cow. So I don't think it seemed to make a whole lot of difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I feel like you can have phosphorus build up even with plant-based.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Well,
I guess I do have a question. Does anybody have roly-poly issues in their high tunnels? And because usually I've never experienced this type of damage from roly-polies on a farm in my life, and I had heard about it, and I was like, it can't be that bad. But they decimate like tomatoes, peas, cucumbers, like anything in their tunnels that are a little bit less hardy. Like they don't really bother brassicas too much, but like you can find like hundreds on a tomato plant just like eating it from the inside out. It's insane. But once like the plants are like established and get a little bit hardier, there's not too much of an issue, but it was definitely a major problem for us last year. But I think that's because of the OM in the tunnels. That's my suspicion.
The one farm that I'm familiar with that was dealing with roly-poly issues is they were using like a lot of straw mulch, and yeah, the high organic matter is when they were seeing the roly-poly issues. And then when they moved away from the straw mulch, then they had fewer issues.
Yeah, we're trying something this year as we were also wood chip mulching all of our pathways. And I have a suspicion that also could have been like a habitat for them. So we're gonna like start emitting that system. It's great for like not needing to weed your pathways, but at the same time, like you're losing your crop potentially because of that.
Well, we are at noon. Kerem, thank you so much for presenting today, and thank you to everyone here. This was a wonderful conversation. We have one more coming up in April in this series, and then everyone will be busy with the season. So I hope to see you all in April.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for the discussion and for your attention.